Inflation is not just rising prices. It is a silent tax that nobody voted for honestly. It creeps through paychecks, savings accounts, grocery aisles, and rent bills with surgical precision daily. And while ordinary families drown, the powerful quietly grow richer because they understand inflation's hidden mechanics. Every empire that mastered money eventually weaponized inflation to extract wealth from those least able resisting. The United States tells itself inflation is temporary, manageable, and controlled by experts wearing expensive suits proudly. But history laughs at that confidence, reminding us inflation rarely arrives loudly. It seeps through unnoticed cracks. Most people think inflation hurts everyone equally, but no lie has damaged more wealth than this. Inflation steals asymmetrically, draining the bottom layers while quietly filling vaults at the economic top. When prices rise faster than wages, paychecks become illusions that fade before rent clears accounts painfully. And yet, the wealthy barely notice because inflation punishes cash holders but rewards asset owners consistently. Stocks rise, real estate appreciates, and debt melts in real terms for those holding leverage intelligently. Meanwhile, the working class watches purchasing power evaporate like mist under a relentless financial sun. But inflation did not become a wealth transfer machine by accident. It evolved through centuries of political necessity. Governments learned long ago that printing money is easier than raising taxes or admitting fiscal weakness openly. The Roman Empire clipped coins, shaving silver content until savings dissolved in citizens' trembling hands historically. France printed assignats backed by seized church lands until the currency died, screaming in marketplaces nationwide. We've told those stories before, but inflation's cruelty didn't stop with emperors or revolutionaries, tragically. Modern inflation is quieter, cleaner, and disguised behind economic jargon that hides the theft elegantly today. It operates through money creation, interest rates, bond markets, and expectations shaped by experts managing narratives carefully. But beneath the charts and speeches lies the same ancient truth history teaches repeatedly across civilizations everywhere. The powerful survive inflation by owning assets. The powerless suffer inflation by owning only currency tragically. To understand why, you need to see inflation's real battlefield, the divide between debtors and savers constantly. Debtors benefit because inflation reduces what they owe in real terms, freeing them from yesterday's burdens slowly. Savers suffer because the dollars they stored faithfully buy less with every passing calendar month annually. Which group do the wealthy belong to? They are almost always debtors owning income-producing assets strategically. Which group do ordinary workers belong to? They are mostly savers fighting erosion they cannot outrun alone. This isn't a conspiracy. It's the architecture of modern finance functioning exactly as designed across decades. Governments borrow, inflate, and erode their own debts, shifting costs quietly onto citizens holding nominal currency piles. Inflation becomes a hidden tax collected not through legislation, but through shrinking purchasing power silently. And unlike normal taxes, inflation punishes the poor at disproportionately higher rates than anyone else consistently. A millionaire with assets watches inflation raise the value of what he already owns comfortably. A grocery clerk watches inflation raise the cost of everything she needs merely to survive painfully, One is carried upward by inflation's tide. The other is pulled under by its undertow, mercilessly. This is why inflation is not just economics. It is moral policy disguised as mathematical inevitability repeatedly. But the story gets darker when central banks step into the frame with polished confidence, theatrically. The Federal Reserve controls the cost of money, the fuel powering every economic engine operating nationwide today. When it lowers rates, borrowing becomes cheap, asset prices surge, and wealth concentrates breathtakingly fast upward. When it raises rates, unemployment rises, credit tightens, and working households bleed while asset owners endure patiently. Either direction, the poor never win because the system treats them as shock absorbers for national policy. Inflation's most brutal feature is that it compounds, meaning losses accelerate even when unnoticed initially. A family losing 5% purchasing power yearly sees half their value gone within a single generation devastatingly. Manuel, a wealthy investor earning modest returns, sees compounding lift their capital into unimaginable heights effortlessly. The system ensures upward transfer because time favors those with assets and punishes those without systematically. But inflation doesn't just reshape personal finances. It rewires entire societies from politics to class structure inevitably. During Weimar Germany, savings evaporated so completely that middle-class families descended into poverty overnight helplessly. Meanwhile, industrialists holding factories, farmland, and loan obligations gained power as their debts dissolved entirely. Inflation dismantled old hierarchies but built new ones where wealth belonged to those holding tangible value primarily. The United States watched this lesson and believed it could avoid such chaos through careful management professionally. But money creation accelerated through crisis 2008, 2020, and ongoing deficits feeding constant balance sheet expansion continually. Each new stimulus, rescue package, or quantitative easing program diluted the value of dollars subtly nationwide today. And while these policies supported markets, they also inflated assets the wealthy already owned heavily beforehand. Whenever inflation rises, governments claim wage growth will protect workers, but that promise fails historically. Wages lag prices, especially for low-skill labor, forcing households into deeper reliance on credit each year. Credit then becomes another wealth transfer mechanism, charging interest to those already harmed by inflation mercilessly. Debt ensures the poor pay twice, once through inflation and again through financialization extracting fees endlessly. Meanwhile, elites borrow at near-zero rates, buy assets, and watch inflation reduce their real liabilities massively. This is not an accident. It is a structural loop that funnels value upward continuously without pause. Economists call it monetary transmission, but historians call it exactly what it is: engineered inequality, unfortunately. The gap widens because inflation rewards capital owners and punishes wage earners, reinforcing class divides predictably. To see inflation's true cost, step into the life of a typical American household currently struggling monthly. Their rent rises annually, groceries increase weekly, utilities spike seasonally. Wages crawl forward painfully, slowly, sadly. Their savings earn almost nothing, yet inflation quietly extracts value from every dollar they manage retaining momentarily. Meanwhile, banks, investors. And institutions see rising valuations and shrinking real debts and elegant wealth siphon operationally. Inflation does not simply raise prices. It redistributes national income toward those with pricing power deliberately. Corporations with scale can adjust prices. Landlords can raise rent. Financial institutions adjust interest strategically. But ordinary workers cannot raise wages on demand. They depend on employers protecting their livelihoods reluctantly. Inflation exposes this asymmetry, showing how power, not productivity, determines who wins economic storms routinely. But inflation also has geopolitical fingerprints because reserve currencies decide global wealth flows dramatically. The United States exports inflation by printing the world's money, shifting costs outward toward foreign holders regularly. Emerging economies pay higher prices for commodities priced in dollars, tightening pressure on their weakest citizens. Thus, American inflation steals from the global poor, while enriching those connected to capital markets inevitably. History warns this system works. Until it doesn't, because confidence, not gold, backs modern currencies entirely. Once trust weakens, inflation can spiral into crises that redefine nations, borders, and economic institutions permanently. Weimar Germany collapsed into political extremism. Zimbabwe collapsed into bartering. Argentina collapses every decade, rhythmically. In each collapse, elites escaped through assets abroad, while ordinary citizens were trapped within imploding local economies. Inflation's cruelty is democratic, in name only. It strikes hardest at those least able to escape quickly. And now the United States faces pressures that echo historical warning. Signs Weaver studied countless times extensively. Mafset's suppli choc, geopolitical freckles, and growing distrust in institutions escalating. These conditions create fertile ground for an inflationary decade that shifts wealth on an unprecedented scale. The rich will navigate it, expand during it, and leverage it, just as history always shows convincingly. But millions of Americans will experience a slow, grinding impoverishment masked by rising nominal wages deceptively. Because inflation convinces people they are earning more while stealing the value behind each dollar discreetly. It turns progress into illusion, growth into stagnation, and paychecks into symbols of purchasing power lost. And by the time people realize the theft, the transfer has already occurred, silently behind economic curtains. Inflation is the perfect crime because its victims cannot point to a single perpetrator personally. ETA system, a loophole and a survival mechanism for indebted governments everywhere. Inflation allows nations to pay back yesterday's promises with tomorrow's cheaper dollars. Shifting burdens subtly downward. It lets politicians spend today without telling voters the real cost hidden beneath temporary prosperity theatrically. It keeps markets inflated, banks solvent, and asset owners wealthy, while savers bleed slowly yet consistently unbearably. This is the silent wealth transfer no politician will ever admit publicly, yet everyone feels painfully. A transfer from workers to corporations, from renters to landlords, from savers to borrowers, from young to old. And unless people understand how inflation reshapes power, they will always stand on the losing side repeatedly. Because inflation isn't just economics. It is class warfare written in digits, charts, and shrinking paychecks nationwide. Inflation's final stage reveals itself when ordinary families feel cornered, while elites quietly reposition advantageously everywhere. It begins subtly, then surges violently, always faster than governments admit, and faster than households can adjust practically. Those with mobility escape early, while those anchored to wages and fixed incomes absorb the hardest blows instantly. This is why inflation becomes a class divide more than an economic event in every historical scenario. Wealthy groups sense inflation months before the public because they stand closest to policy-making and financial signals. They see credit tightening, money supply shifting, and asset flows changing long before newspapers acknowledge reality publicly. They convert savings into property, commodities, foreign assets, and businesses, preparing for erosion before erosion appears visibly. Meanwhile, ordinary households learn last, reacting only after grocery bills rise and paychecks shrink with alarming regularity. Inflation punishes those who rely on stability while rewarding those who thrive under volatility. Financially and strategically, if your income is fixed, inflation destroys you. If your debt is fixed, inflation benefits you materially. Each delayed decision compounds over years, becoming generational disadvantage silently disguised as economic adaptation for survival. This is how inflation creates inequality, not temporarily, but permanently, across multiple generations without dramatic headlines. Yet, inflation operates very differently for the powerful, who treat it as an opportunity rather than an unavoidable disaster. Corporations raise prices faster than input costs, widening margins while blaming inflation instead of strategy publicly. Private equity firms buy distressed businesses and foreclosed homes at discounts created directly by inflationary pressure. Large investors accumulate undervalued assets as ordinary families liquidate. To survive, month-to-month cash shortages inevitably. But inflation also strengthens governments in subtle ways invisible to most citizens distracted by everyday survival demands. When prices rise, tax revenues increase automatically, even if tax rates stay unchanged on paper legislatively. This phenomenon bracket creep lets governments collect more without political backlash because citizens blame stores instead. Inflation becomes a silent tax, draining households while strengthening government budgets without public debate or accountability. As inflation persists, it reshapes societal trust, eroding faith in leaders, institutions, and national currencies progressively. Middle classes become anxious, watching savings shrink, wages stagnate, and housing prices sprint far beyond affordability. An anxious middle class becomes fertile ground for political extremes because moderation dies when security disappears entirely. This is why inflation destabilizes democracies. It dissolves the economic foundation required to sustain political calm and consensus. Once trust breaks, people search for alternatives: gold, dollars, crypto, land, or foreign banking accounts persistently. These alternatives act as lifeboats, protecting value from sinking alongside collapsing domestic currency systems. Historically, those who move early find refuge. Those who delay arrive when the lifeboats are already overflowing, tragically. Inflation rewards urgency, not loyalty, because currency loyalty becomes financial suicide when governments lose control fully. To understand the mechanics clearly, examine inflation's winners and losers through the lens of basic financial structure. Winners include borrowers, asset owners, landlords, corporations, and leveraged investors whose debts shrink in real terms naturally. Losers include fixed-income retirees, wage earners, savers, renters, and public sector workers whose income lags behind inflation chronically. Inflation transforms the economy into a battlefield where leverage wins and stability loses almost every time historically. This silent transfer occurs automatically, requiring no corruption, only the mathematical structure of inflation itself effortlessly. To see inflation's full impact, examine nations where currency trust completely collapsed and never recovered meaningfully afterward. Zimbabwe's citizens transitioned to US dollars. Argentina's middle class stores dollars secretly. Lebanon's economy partially dollarized recently. Once people distrust currency, they abandon it mentally long before abandoning it physically, accelerating collapse brutally. Inflation is psychological first, financial second, and political third by the time people notice collapse is already advanced. If major economies ever experienced similar breakdowns, the effects would be uneven and brutally unforgiving on low-income households. Those with diversified assets would endure. Those dependent on paychecks would face financial extinction they never anticipated. This divergence mirrors every historical collapse. Wealth survives through diversification, while poverty collapses through concentration inevitably. Inflation widens this gap continuously until society resembles two separate countries sharing one failing currency uncomfortably. But inflation rarely destroys societies. Alone people's reactions amplify damage rapidly. When panic replaces rational financial behavior, fear causes bank runs. Distrust causes hoarding, panic causes capital flight. Social tension causes political explosions violently. Inflation lights the match, but human behavior spreads the fire. Consuming institutions already weakened by mismanagement historically. Those with resources escape early. Those without remain trapped, reinforcing inequality through survival rather than economic choice. However, individuals can defeat inflation personally, even when nations cannot defeat it collectively or politically. You defeat inflation by owning assets, not currency. By developing skills, not titles. By diversifying location exposure intelligently. Those who understand inflation prepare early. Those who ignore history face consequences identical to past collapses inevitably. Because inflation has ruined more empires and families than wars, pandemics, or political revolutions combined historically. You cannot prevent inflation from redistributing wealth, but you can choose which direction your wealth moves intentionally. If you hold cash, inflation steals aggressively. If you hold debt, inflation repays indirectly. If you hold assets, inflation enriches subtly. This is the structure of survival. Inflation becomes a weapon only if you remain positioned incorrectly financially. History's winners were not lucky. They understood the physics of value better than their governments understood monetary discipline. They owned land after plagues, gold after wars, dollars after collapses, and skills after technological shifts rapidly. They trusted scarcity, not speeches, production, not policies, mobility, not stability, assets, not wages repeatedly. Inflation stripped illusions until only reality remained ownership. Leverage, production, scarcity, and skill determined wealth outcomes unmistakably. Everything else, political promises, monetary slogans, patriotic slogans, disappeared under the relentless pressure of compounding inflation. Inflation is the world's most elegant theft mechanism, transferring wealth upward without breaking laws or raising suspicion openly. It is legal, invisible, unregulated, and continuous. Its victims remain unaware until the damage becomes irreversible financially. But those who understand its mechanics stop being victims and start becoming. survivors who eventually become beneficiaries. Because inflation cannot destroy those who prepare early, it can only accelerate their rise as others fall painfully. Inflation is not coming, it is already moving. The transfer has already begun. The only remaining question is whether you stand among the extracted or among the prepared. If this gave you a new way to see inflation's true mechanics and consequences, hit subscribe. History already wrote the warnings. I'm here to help you read them